Morning, everyone. My name is Michael Boswell. I'm a professor of city and regional planning here in the College of Architecture and Environmental Design. My work is in environmental planning and policy, and specifically I've been working on climate issues and sustainability issues for quite a number of years. I'm co-author of a book called Local Climate Action Planning, which is intended to assist local communities in acting on climate issues. And I'm currently working with UN Habitat to develop guidance for global cities on addressing climate change. It's my distinct pleasure this morning to introduce our next speaker. It's Renata Brillinger. She is the executive director and the co-founder of the California Climate and Agricultural Network. And for the past 17 years, she's worked on a variety of sustainable food systems projects in different capacities, including a number of nonprofit administrative roles. Prior to her work with CalCan, she was program director at the Climate Protection Campaign, and she focused on renewable energy and agricultural issues there. And for 7 years, she also served as director of Californians for GE-Free Agriculture, which was a coalition of sustainable agricultural and environmental organizations that were providing education on genetic engineering issues in agriculture. Currently, she serves on the steering committee for the California Rangeland Conservation Coalition, the steering committee of the Center for Sustainability here at Cal Poly, and also with that other school on the advisory board of UC Davis Agricultural Sustainability Institute. So thank you. Let's a round of applause for Renata.
You got to be careful about your university affiliations. I'm trying to balance them out. Well, thanks for having me here, Hunter, wherever you are, flitting around somewhere. It's always good to come down to a little bit further south. We tend to be based up in Sacramento and get a little narrow in our views, so I like these chances to do these road trips. So I'm going to just introduce you just a little bit to CalCan. We go by, California Climate and Agriculture Network, and then get into some of the work that we're involved in and thinking that we're doing with a lot of other amazing thinkers around the state on climate change and agriculture. CalCan's a coalition of nonprofit organizations that work on sustainable agriculture and food issues. We've been together 6 years, a little more than 6 years now. And we really continue to be pretty much the only consistent voice that works on climate and agriculture policy issues at the state level and also a little bit at the federal level in the Farm Bill conservation programs. And what we effectively are after is to find resources that support farmers and ranchers in better preparing to adapt to climate change, be more resilient, and also to do what they can to help mitigate or reduce the problem of greenhouse gas emissions. So we try to remove barriers to practices that have climate benefits. We try to find funding and resources to incentivize voluntary actions to get better and better at doing the kind of food and farming systems that we think will serve us in the 21st century. So this focus today on resilient farming and food systems, I think, is really a good container for considering how agriculture can better prepare itself for climate change, which I would argue is our #1 challenge looking ahead, and is the result of a lot of mistakes I think we've made in all sectors of human activity over the years. I kind of look at climate change as our last chance to get things right, finally, and the stakes are obviously pretty high. Before I get into, I'm going to start with some bad news and then hopefully move into some good news. But I thought I should probably tell you that just a little bit of context in terms of agriculture and climate change. Agriculture is responsible for, as the state makes its inventory of greenhouse gas emissions, agriculture is responsible for approximately 7% of the state's emissions. That's just off the farm. That's not including the sort of upstream and downstream impacts of food production. So it's not the fertilizers or pesticides, and it's not the packaging or transportation. So just what kind of comes off the farm is about 7%. So not a super large chunk of the emissions. Most of our emissions come from transportation. But as I hope I convince you by the time I'm done talking, I think there's a tremendous opportunity for agriculture to be a big part of the solution, disproportionately big part of the solution. The three gases, greenhouse gases, that we need to be thinking about when we consider agriculture are carbon dioxide, which is the unit that all greenhouse gases are measured in, that all the gases are converted to CO2 equivalents, just for ease of accounting. So CO2 is produced in agriculture through a number of practices that have to do with the carbon cycle, carbon being an important element in growing plants, but also a problem if it's in the atmosphere. A second gas that's really important in agriculture is nitrous oxide, which is very potent. These other two are very, very potent. They're responsible for more significant greenhouse gas effects, global warming effects, but they're also shorter lived. So there's sort of an interesting relationship there between the potency and the life of these gases. So nitrous oxide is one of them, and that comes primarily from the use of nitrogen in growing plants. Again, an essential nutrient to the plant, but when it's not used efficiently by the plant, it can denitrify, essentially goes through its own chemical cycle and becomes, some of it can become nitrous oxide in the atmosphere. And then the third gas is methane, which comes in agriculture from a couple of primary sources. One from rice production. Methane in rice fields is produced when the fields are flooded. The organic matter in those fields, the waste from the rice harvest, is decomposed by bacteria that are anaerobic, because there's no oxygen under there, and then this methane gas comes off. Another big source of methane in agriculture is livestock. Both ends of the cow, as it were, produce methane, and the waste products themselves produce methane. So that's just a little bit of background about, just sort of to give you a sense of the question of agriculture and climate change and the problems. So I'm just going to quickly talk about some of the impacts of, since we're talking about resilience here, as I said, I think thinking about climate change and its impacts is one of the key questions agriculture faces when it considers how viable it can be over the coming generations. We'll talk a little bit about impacts. We'll talk about, this is where the bad news starts to hopefully shift into good news, how to become more resilient, how the farm systems here in California can become more resilient, and I think we'll see that there's a lot of benefits that come with making that transition. I just want to tell a few farmer stories, just to sort of put some faces on some of these concepts. And then lastly, what we do is a lot of work in the policy arena, trying to change the rules so that the incentives are in place for farmers to make a good contribution. The caveat whenever we talk about the big topic on our minds these days in California around drought and climate change, always the caveat is, we don't know that this drought is caused by climate change. And I don't want to imply that anyone would say that, although there actually was a fairly interesting study pretty recently that did correlate the high temperatures and the lack of rain that are climate caused or are trending in climate change with this drought. But any one single weather event or year cannot be definitively linked to climate change. But what we can say, what the modelers and the experts who study climate change say, is that these cycles of greater stress, water stress or temperature stress or other things, will become more prevalent, more frequent, and more intense as time goes on. So we are facing a historical drought here, both in terms of severity and length we don't know yet. The predictions I've heard, some of the predictions I've heard are pretty scary about how long this could go on. And the impacts of this drought, I think, they're really warning signs as we look down the road. So to just put a few numbers up here about what last year's numbers were showing. 400,000 acres plus or minus were fallowed last year that are the result of water scarcity, and approximately 17,000 ag-related jobs were lost just in the valley alone. I've heard such a big range in terms of how many billions of dollars of impact this represents, so I didn't try to give you the range. We can feel fairly sure it's in the billions at this point. And I was struck by last year when I was looking at some pictures, the similarities to the Dust Bowl photos that you know that are up here that you can compare. Some other climate impacts that we can expect that are predicted and that are already being felt to some extent are, on the top of the list, I wanted to put this chill hour issue because it's very unique to agriculture. You don't hear a lot about it when you hear a lot of experts talking outside of farming circles. But chill hours, in essence, are the requirement that certain fruit and nut tree varieties have to properly set fruit, flower, and set fruit. And different varieties have different amounts of cold that they need in order to properly mature each season and then bear fruit. And they vary depending on the variety, and they vary also depending on the timing. So this is a question in part of how cold it gets and also when those cold cycles come. And what we can be very sure of is that there are already some pretty significant impacts being felt, particularly cherries. You may have seen that in the news last year. There was a very, very low cherry yield that was correlated with insufficient chill hours. So we're starting to see growers considering how to bring in new varieties, how to transition out as their orchards naturally age, or sometimes prematurely transition out some of these varieties to introduce varieties that require fewer chill hours. We're also seeing some of the tree crops moving north. We'll see that probably continue as a trend. I'd be interested to hear from Paul and others about what they're seeing in the wine sector. I think you're also likewise seeing the colder varieties moving to the coast and north is my general understanding of that. Obviously, with perennial crops, it's hard to just trade them out, you know, in one given year. So it's something that bears, and also the breeding programs that are needed to you know, bring in new varieties take a while. So this is an example, as I think Paul said, also of the need for long-term thinking and planning. We're seeing new pests and new diseases. I just read yesterday about a story of a new scale that has been seen in some walnut crops up in Solano and Yolo counties this year. As the weather changes, as temperatures move, pests are much more adaptable than we are. They breed faster. They're very good at finding niches. And humans, as you know, will probably lag in their tools in terms of dealing with them. So this is going to be, I think, an increasing challenge. We already have a lot of difficulty in this state with invasive species of all kinds. As I said earlier, that we're going to see more extreme and erratic weather events, much less predictability. Growers are very, very good at dealing with unpredictability. But what I would argue, and what I think the models tell us, is that that ability to adapt is going to, in some cases, probably overwhelm the creativity, the innovation, the can-do kind of spirit that growers necessarily have to stay in the business. And I think it's our collective responsibility to step in and provide some resources to meet that challenge. And then, of course, the heat stress issue, especially in the Central Valley for both animals and laborers. All of these things are going to have an impact on yields, and they all have economic impacts, food access considerations, and so on. So that's the bad news. There's a lot more that can be said about the bad news, but I think I want to move pretty quickly into questions about resilience and opportunities that I think that this challenge really creates for us collectively. I want to throw a couple terms before I get into some of these, this list of the kinds of practices that seem to have the most benefit for creating more resilient systems. There's a couple terms to just throw out at you. One is mitigation, that you'll hear in policy circles especially. Mitigation is just a fancy word for reducing the problem. So in this case, it means reducing greenhouse gas emissions. It can also mean sequestering carbon in soil or in woody plants in the case of agriculture. So storing that carbon, pulling it out of the atmosphere where it's problematic for global warming, and storing it in places where it's actually beneficial for the production of plants. So mitigation is is trying to address the climate change problem, and adaptation is the other fancy word that policymakers use, that is basically the ability to deal with the impacts. So another word you'll hear more and more, I think, is resilient systems. So when you look at the built environment, our buildings, our roads, our transportation systems, and so on, sometimes these mitigation and adaptation are hard to achieve together at once. So if you think about, for example, one way to adapt to rising sea level can be to build seawalls, which takes an incredible amount of energy and exacerbates our climate problem, and doesn't necessarily have any other benefit to it whatsoever. When you look at agriculture, actually what's really exciting is that we can achieve both mitigation, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and we can be more resilient with the way we grow food. So I think it's an area that we need a lot more understanding about, but has tremendous potential not just to address climate change, but also to achieve a number of other benefits. So I'm going to run through some general science-based principles or tools or techniques or strategies for both mitigation and adaptation in agriculture. There's a fact sheet back. We have a little table at the back that we're sharing with our coalition partner, Community Alliance with Family Farmers. If you want to pick up a fact sheet, it's fairly recent. We just put out the latest literature review of 125 or so scientific papers that describe the best practices for responding to climate change. So you can geek out on the science if you want. So I'm just going to pull a few of these out now and just to highlight them. Soil building is clearly a tool that we can use to both address climate change and also be more resilient. And the way that soil gets built, there's different terms that get used. Increasing the organic matter in soil, or the fertility, organic fertility, the carbon content. There's different terms that get thrown around. Some of the ways that this is done most effectively from a climate point of view is to add compost, manure, and or cover crops. Cover crops being non-cash crops that are grown in between the cash crops that pull nitrogen out of the air and store it in soil as a source of fertilizer, an alternative to synthetic nitrogen fertilizers. Another type of tool that will help us with more resilient farming systems is to biodiversify, not just in our crops cycles and our intercropping and our crop rotations, but also on the farmscape generally. So planting of trees, introducing or integrating agroforestry, forestry lots, keeping them intact as much as possible. As you can imagine, the biomass of trees stores quite a bit of carbon. So it's a great sink for the carbon, pulling it out of the atmosphere and putting it in these plants. Using hedgerows along lanes or field boundaries, along rivers, riparian plantings along rivers or creeks or other waterways. All of these things create habitat for wildlife, store carbon, and help with a number. I'll actually get to some of the multiple benefits in a second, but are a good tool for addressing climate change. On-farm renewable energy is a huge area of potential. California is currently the largest producer of on-farm renewable energy in the country, but there's a lot more that can be done. I think we're an estimated 12% or so of California's farms are producing some form of renewable energy. There's, solar is one way, wind is another, but also, if we think carefully about this, I think there might be some appropriate uses of agricultural waste that could be turned into heat or gas, natural gas, or electricity. There's a great deal of interest in biochar also in this arena, which isn't technically a renewable energy, but it does produce energy in the producing of biochar, and the biochar can be added to the soil as a soil amendment. And then the last area I wanted to just call out is water and energy conservation, and of course, especially the water conservation piece is getting a lot of attention these days with the drought and and some of the mandates in the urban areas that are coming down from the state. But there's a lot of opportunity as well here. Agriculture's done quite a good job, actually, of improving its irrigation efficiency, but there are other things that can be done, like putting ponds or other forms of catchment for water on farms, doing a better job of monitoring moisture in the soil, and then improving the precision and the efficiency of applying water. And then, of course, energy conservation. Water and energy conservation go hand in hand in agriculture. A big source of energy use in agriculture is just the delivery of the water to the farm and then on the farm. So we can really, this is typically known as one of the most economical places to make some changes on your farm, because you'll see a cost savings immediately and a tremendous return on investment. So a great place, we would say, to invest some state funding to accelerate and incentivize those kinds of activities. So just as I said, I wanted to talk a little bit about the multiple benefits here. Soil building, among other things, improves the water and air quality. If we can move away from synthetic nitrogen fertilizers, we can get benefits for health, for the environment at large, and as I said, we can sequester carbon. We can also, in some areas, and I know it is challenging, and given certain soils, as Gerald was talking about, it's challenging to sequester carbon in soil, depending on a number of factors, but there are places and tools and strategies and farming systems where that is possible, and we work with some of the growers that are making a lot of gains in bringing that carbon, putting it in soil. Wildlife habitat, as I said, is a place to sequester carbon, and also make sure that we have habitat for the, I think in Anne's question, she was talking about biodiversifying, so that we have, and actually Gerald's answer too was regarding the trap crops or the pollinator habitat and so on, so we have natural predators for some of these new pests that are going to be coming in. On-farm renewable energy production has economic benefits for growers, energy independence benefits, and likewise with water and energy conservation, obviously, as the water mandates and costs increase, we're going to see growers are going to have a harder and harder time to, and need to keep up, either for economic reasons and or regulatory reasons. And then I wanted to make sure to mention the importance of considering farmland protection in this whole equation. Just the act of keeping land in farming has a climate benefit. It's fairly intuitive if you think about it. The amount of embedded energy in an urban area and the vehicle miles, traveled associated with sprawling development, which is a really big problem in California. We lose an average of 50,000 acres of prime farmland every year. This is a very, very serious crisis, I would even say. Not only because of the impacts on our ability to produce food and keep that economic engine going, but also for climate reasons. We've got to keep that land in production, if only to reduce the amount of energy that is associated with sprawling development. So it's a way to partner on the urban edge with efforts to do smarter growth, infill development, that kind of transit-oriented development. And I'm sure, I actually know there are people in this university who are experts in thinking about the urban side of this equation. And there's all kinds of benefits that come along with protecting ag land on the urban edge. So just a couple of quick stories. Some of my favorite people. I just get so inspired by meeting these folks, visiting their farms, and talking to them about how they're figuring all this stuff out. Joe and Julie Morris, actually, Elaine is here. Where are you? I just saw you. There, is a neighbor. You're working with them on the Rancher to Rancher project? Yeah. So talk to her. It's really great to see you here. So Joe and Julie are grass-fed beef producers in the San Juan Bautista, San Benito County, and they're in a neighborhood of other ranchers who are really working in partnership to figure out how to both stay in business, be good stewards of this amazing rangeland down there, and also increase carbon sequestration in soils. So they use intensive grazing management where they have a lot of small paddocks that they rotate their cattle through very frequently. Actually, there's another expert I just noticed who you'll be hearing from, I think, next, Mark in the front here, way up at the other end of the state. So he'll tell you better than I can, more authentically, with more credibility than I can about how this is done. But the principle of it is that if you manage your grazing so that you're achieving a healthy balance between the forage production, the grass production, and the root growth underneath, you'll eventually over time, and it can take a long time, you'll see an increase in carbon that can hold over time. And Joe just spoke at a conference we organized about 6 or 8 weeks ago, and he's been monitoring his soil carbon, and he had some very exciting news to share. They've been monitoring it at different depths, and he's seen, remarkably, given the drought they've been getting some, like, what is it, 6 or 7 inches of rain at this point is what you've got in the last few years, a year. It's just a really difficult environment in which to ranch, and yet, because of this this intensive grazing strategy he's using, they're still sequestering carbon. So it's early, to know for sure how permanent this is, but it's an incredible trend. It's very exciting. And they direct market all their own beef, so they're inspirations in a number of ways. And then I think maybe, I don't know if I planned this or not, but Ann Thrupp used to be at Fetzer Vineyard up in Mendocino, also I think a neighbor of Paul's. Another model farm, I would say, in terms of what they've done to really proactively address and understand their impact from a climate change perspective. So this is a list, it's not even a complete list. There's a fact sheet back there that details it more, of all the things that Fetzer has done, much of it under Ann's tenure, I think, she's no longer there, but she was there as a sustainability manager, and they've just done an amazing amount of work, both in their vineyards and in their winery and their bottling facility to reduce their carbon footprint. And then we just have dozens and dozens of folks that we work with. These are a few other pictures. I just wanted to point out Jeff Mitchell. He's the second from the left at the top there. He's kneeling down in the field, and he's UC Davis Extension staff person, and he's been doing for years. He's been running research and training programs for growers in the 5 Points area in the valley, south and west of Fresno, and they're figuring out how to do conventional tillage and cover cropping. I don't think they're working in organic systems yet. I would hope that they can move into that at some point. And they just published a paper in February. It was after we did our fact sheet, so it's not in there. But they're seeing that they can get really good results at depth of carbon sequestration in fields that are both reduced tillage and cover cropped. That combination seems to be especially important, not only for carbon sequestration, but for yields. So it's incredibly exciting that we can get all of these. And if you think about conservation tillage or no-till or reduced tillage, what that means is fewer passes over the field. So that translates into lower labor costs and lower fuel costs. So it's a multiple win strategy. And I would just love to see more of his work held up and funded. So to that end, I'm just going to quickly, I want to leave some time for questions and comments, but quickly talk about what we do and how we're trying to accelerate those models, those innovators, and push out their work and magnify it through using policy tools, through changing the rules and changing the incentives. So what we argue over and over again in the state legislature is that we need more state support to do on-farm demonstration projects and research, as well as basic and applied. We need both basic and applied research. We need better technical assistance so that extension agents and resource conservation districts and nonprofits can better tell growers, translate that science into practice, and be that bridge between what really happens on the farm and what research says should happen. And we need incentives for growers. It's risky business to change your practices. It's not, we can't all be Paul Dolans and Bel Campos and Fetzers. We have to support the folks who are not going to be out there in front blazing the trail to make the transition, to mitigate some of the risks that are involved with buying new equipment or taking time to build up your knowledge base or whatever it might be, sometimes suffering yield losses maybe, or, you know, as they make the shift. And then we think there should be money put back into farmland conservation. The state used to fund a program called Williamson Act, which would protect farmland. We think there should be now new money for protecting farmland because of the climate benefits. And actually there is some new money, I'm happy to say. So, so the specific, there's a lot of different initiatives we work on. I just want to talk about one just for the sake of time. It's, I think, one of our most powerful tools and opportunities collectively, which is this bill that was passed in 2006, AB 32. It was under Arnold Schwarzenegger's rule. And it's been assertively, aggressively implemented ever since then. It's a very complicated set of programs and bills. The one I'll talk about is cap and trade, which you've probably heard about in the news, but is not that well understood, I think, in most cases. The cap and trade program in California, at least, produces a carbon market, which you've probably heard about, where a marketplace where the big emitters of greenhouse gas emissions can also buy carbon credits from other players who voluntarily reduce their emissions. That is going on. It's not something we focus on very much, simply because there's not yet very many rules that allow farmers to participate, and I'm somewhat skeptical there ever will be, or in the near term there will be. But it also, the cap and trade program in California also creates this public source of funding that comes from the requirement that these big emitters of greenhouse gas emissions have to basically pay into a fund. It's a little more complicated than that, but this fund is under public control and under the legislative and under the authority of the legislature and the governor each year to decide how to spend that money on activities that will reduce greenhouse gas emissions that aren't regulated. So this is not the big emitters, the big industrial emitters, but other sectors. And we've been playing to try to get some of that money into agriculture, because we think if we don't invest in agricultural solutions, we're just not going to meet these targets. We may get to the 2020 target, which is the AB 32 target for reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but there are much more ambitious targets that are being set right now. The governor just made an executive order about 2030. He has required that we get to an even more ambitious target by 2030, and then there's a bill working its way through the legislature right now that would set an even higher target. So it's very ambitious. It's among the most ambitious goals certainly in the country. It's far and ahead the most ambitious goal, and even globally when you look around, it's right up there in terms of difficult and challenging, and in line with what scientists tell us we need to do collectively if we're going to really avoid catastrophic effects of climate change. And agriculture has not yet been well tapped, is what we would argue. But there are some hopeful signs. Governor Brown, in his January inaugural address, at the very end was kind of running through a list of things he wanted to see happen with regard to climate change, and he said, for the first time I've ever heard, that we must include agriculture for its ability to store carbon. There's only 3 places we can really get carbon out of the atmosphere. There's the oceans, which are pretty saturated at this point and having tremendous difficulty with how much carbon they're soaking up. It's causing major collapses of ecosystems in the oceans. There are forests, which some people consider part of agriculture, and then there's agricultural production. There's the plants and the soil in agriculture. There's a brand new initiative that I hope Secretary Ross will talk about after lunch, the Healthy Soils Initiative. It was just, an outline for it was just released. There's a lot of detail still to be forthcoming, but that's how it was described in the January budget. Very exciting. The amount of attention that's being paid to soil health these days in the administration and elsewhere. In the 2014-15 budget, out of the fund I was mentioning that the big emitters of greenhouse gases pay into. There was $872 million last year. It's big money. I mean, that's pretty big. It's going to get bigger over time. This year, it's probably going to be $2 billion in this account that has to be dispersed to various sectors of California to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Last year, we only saw 30 million of it going towards agriculture, as it's broken down there. A little bit to a brand new program that would protect farmland with permanent easements, and a little bit for water conservation, and then for some bioenergy projects. What we are doing is, a big part of our efforts these days is going into this bill that we co-sponsor along with CAF, SB 367, sponsored by, or introduced rather by Senator Lois Wolk. And it does a number of things, but in short, it authorizes the Department of Food and Agriculture to implement a program that would be funded with those greenhouse gas funds and would provide, it would sort of set up a competitive grants program for growers to apply, and it would accelerate, it would give them funding to do on-farm demonstration projects. There would be a requirement that they would do outreach and education so that more people can learn about it. They would have to measure the benefits and the effects, including the economic feasibility. And then this bill also makes suggestions about how much money should be put into this next year of agricultural activities. So we want to see the farmland conservation piece grow from 5 million to 20 million. This just in the first year, and we want to see for the first time ever a rather large, I mean, I would say it's a modest investment in on-farm demonstration projects of $50 million. So I'd be happy to talk with you more about that bill offline. It received unanimous support in both of its first two committees, bipartisan support, so we're cautiously optimistic about its chances of proceeding in some form or another. It's a very challenging, competitive arena. A lot of people see this shiny new money and are really excited about it, and a lot of it's going to really good things like public transportation and weatherizing homes and subsidizing low-income retrofits and housing, retrofits and that kind of thing. Really, really good stuff. Forest protection, but so far agriculture has been underfunded, in our opinion. So that gives you a link there to the website if you want to learn more about it. The very last thing I'll say before we have a few questions at least is just there's a quote that I came across a year or two ago that just always has stayed with me ever since. It was by current governor of Washington State, Governor Inslee, and he said, "We are the first generation to feel the sting of climate change and the last that can do anything about it." And I think about that on a regular basis, because our time really, we are at this, I know probably every generation says we're at this pivotal moment in history, but I think the science supports this, that we have now everything we need to know about how serious what we're facing is, and what we now need to turn our attention to is how to respond in a very powerful, very courageous way to that. It's not going to be easy. It's going to require change. That's scary. But we have a lot of tools and a lot of amazing thinkers, and I count myself lucky to be surrounded by so many of them. And I would invite you to sign up on our list so that we can tell you when we need you to take a quick action. Once or twice a year is all we really ask of people, to make a call to their senator or their assembly member, and it makes a huge difference to have folks, especially on farming issues, call from a city or a farmer themselves. It really makes an impact. It's not something that legislators are used to at this point. They're used to those petitions online where you just click and a bunch of names are come in. But if you would be willing to make a call once or twice a year, we'll let you know when the right time is. And there's one coming up actually in June. So please do talk with me afterwards or sign up on the list, and hopefully we can hear a few questions at least.
Thank you, Renata. Obviously a hot topic, pardon the pun, but how about a question or two for Renata? We have about 5 minutes. Anyone have anything that they would like to ask in relation to climate?
So Renata, I ran into John Wick from the Carbon Project,
yeah.
and he said that there was some new new information that he thought was really quite promising. Are you familiar with that, and can you share that?
Sure, yeah. John Wick's been working on and funding, to some extent, the Marin Carbon Project based in Marin. Basically, in short, they've done two different, they published a paper with the help of a UC Berkeley researcher in 2 different sites, one in Marin and one in the Sierra foothills. And they put a application of compost on the rangeland, 1/4 inch and 1/2 inch. They tried both, and they've found that there's carbon stored in the soil at some depth, forgetting if they went to 18 inches or 24 inches, but some depth. And they've done some computer modeling to show that the persistence of that carbon is fairly long-term. So it's interesting, and there's you know, more work to be done, certainly, to think about how feasible that is and what parts of the state, rather, it makes sense to truck compost to rangeland, how to overcome some of the economic barriers. Some geographic regions may or may not work, just really depending on irrigation or rainfall, rather. So I think, I would hope that some of the work we're doing to get some money available to do more research would help their efforts, because they could test it out in some other places and address some of the questions that still remain about feasibility.
Hi, Renata. I'm from the Green Space Land Trust in Cambria, and it's a North Coast community surrounded by a lot of agriculture, primarily rangeland agriculture, some organic farming going on. The big problem there is that many of the farmers are retiring, and we're looking at the potential loss of agricultural land. And I was wondering if you could comment on that, and if you have any ideas for engaging communities in saving their agricultural lands.
Yeah. It's a big topic, and if you're working with land trusts, you know some of the issues better than I do, probably. I think that there's probably a number of reasons that we see ag land go out of production. One is the affordability of the land, the profit considerations for young people. I mean, my perception is there are throngs, multitudes of young people that are interested in farming, but a lot of them aren't interested in large-scale farming or don't have the capital. They're not coming from farming, families where they inherited the land or were able to, get it more affordably. So I think we have more questions than answers on this one, how to make that land profitable. I do think that permanent easements, and whether they're federally funded or through this cap-and-trade program, are going to help, because that lowers the value of the land. But we've also got pressures from investors driving the cost back up, farmland and speculators and investors. So there are some really interesting regionally based training programs that are coming up. AG, I don't know, I think you're doing some of them down here, right? You're working with some young people and training them. There's some up in, there's a Center for Land-Based Learning. There's a farm called Soilborn. There's Alba, which works mostly with minority farmers. They're just north of here near Watsonville. So there's these really great little projects that are trying to bring young people along and train them, but it's slow going, and it doesn't address some of the systemic problems. So if it weren't almost impossible to think about how to do it, I think what we really need is some major land reform legislation, and some limits on what investors and speculators can do with regard to purchasing farmland. I just haven't heard anybody talk about that as though it's a serious possibility. But I tend to think about how you address the system. I love these exciting projects, but they're not going to be enough soon enough. So they're good beacons, they're good models, they work out a lot of the problems, but we've got to change the rules. And that's not something we've worked on, but I think it's clearly a crisis that has to be addressed more widely. Sorry, that's kind of a cop-out answer.
Yeah. Renata, in your outreach experience, is the ag community embracing the idea that they have a role to play in both causing climate change and also addressing it and mitigating it?
That's a great question. I've seen a big change in the 6 years we've been around. I think many people don't want to look at the cause part. That's just no fun, right? None of us wants to think about how much we drive and what we could do to, reduce our impacts. But with regard to the work we're doing, for example, on this bill, the one I talked about at the very end, the Farm Bureau signed on, which is very exciting to us because they represent so many farmers and they have a big tent, you know, everything from extremely conventional or even industrial agriculture to really small organic growers. So the fact that they see merits in this is encouraging to me because so far they haven't taken a very proactive position all this time. They've been more concerned about getting regulated than about being constructive players, and that's shifting. So that gives me a tremendous amount of hope. And when I say Farm Bureau, I'm talking about the State Farm Bureau. I know the local chapters are a really different kind of story. Some really, you know, some of the folks we work with are really active in their farm bureaus at the local level. So, and Western growers and even, you know, less progressive farm, you know, lobby group is, I think, also going to be signing on. So I do think now that there's some real money, you know, available to, and the approach taken is focusing on incentivizing, not regulating. I think, I'm hoping that what conventional ag is seeing is that if they get ahead of this with an incentives approach and really make it work well, then they can hopefully minimize some of the regulatory impacts, which everybody is afraid are coming. Yeah, thank you.